Could I have your attention, please?
He's 98% dependent.
That sounded like my husband. No. It's really been a busy 10 days for the Heron Area Historical Society. We've had Gillum Ferguson last week, which many of you attended, thanks to Gordon. We had that Illinois author. And then yesterday we had Van Austin, and many of you were over at the Historical Village, the Harrison Bruce Historical Village, and we appreciate your coming over there. And we heard a wonderful story from Van about Heron history. And we want to tell you to keep us on your radar for the month of June. And we haven't set the date yet, but we're going to have a wonderful program on the history of Heron Hospital, which dates to 1914, and the tremendous growth that many of us have experienced if we live in the area, that we see what has become a major medical complex right here in this small town of Heron, Illinois. Kathy Cerruti, who is a longtime staffer at Heron Hospital, will be speaking to us. And if you haven't heard Kathy speak, she's very warm and very engaging to hear her speak, and loves Heron Hospital. She's been there since she graduated from Heron High School, so she's a long careerist at the hospital and a Heron native, and also part of the Italians in Heron. And we're going to have a new hospital administrator come with her, and if you haven't met Terrence Farrell, you're going to be mightily impressed with him. And he has come to us from the East Coast, has wonderful credentials, and is now the main man, if you will, at Heron Hospital. So that will be coming up in June. But today, we have a wonderful piece of area history, not just Heron history, and she has come to us from her home in Bloomington. She is the daughter of the late Lee and Elva Booth. He was a longtime educator and superintendent here in Williamson County. I actually lived just a few blocks from him in Bel Air in the 80s and 90s, and they were lovely people. They are both deceased. This is their daughter, Betty Rademacher. She is a graduate of Marion High School when they lived over that way. She has multiple degrees. She also graduated from SIU. She has a BS in Business Administration and an MS in Educational Psychology and Counseling, and she did postmaster's work in higher education. She was a university administrator and a counselor. She worked at Illinois State University, Illinois Wesleyan, and SIU. She also was, like many of us in this room, she was a great community volunteer. She's going to speak to us today about two books that she is the author of, one with her father. And she's going to talk about an area that we all think of in its beauty. And now I know there are people in this room, other than Betty, who actually lived there. The Gumps are here. Several of you mentioned, Rosemary mentioned that she knew people and had friends in that area. And we also have Bill Carnaghi here, who is taping everything that we do. So if you don't want to be on camera, don't come up and stand by me or by the speaker. And I'm not going to apologize for what I have on, but it's not a clown suit. It is Heron Festa Italiana. And I've been at the Bank of Heron, Carl's Bank, had a wonderful breakfast this morning at the bank at the Civic Center. So I'll probably shed this about midnight tonight. But thank you for coming. And we want to welcome our fine speaker today, who is as lovely as in person as she is in her book, and Betty Rademacher.
Thank you so much. I feel honored to be here the week of Heron Festa. That's such a wonderful celebration that you all do every year, and it's very nice to be here during that time. I want to say a thank you to Jack Odom. We spoke about this presentation several months, years ago. We were talking about a book that I had written with my dad, Lee Booth, and we just kind of stood out in the street in front of my house down in Southern Township and talked about the possibility of my sharing some of these stories. This is not a book yet. It's a manuscript and a lot of stories, and maybe someday it will be a book. I don't know. But also thank you to Phil and Cheryl for following up with Jack's suggestion and scheduling this date for me. I want to take a minute to introduce a couple of people. My husband, David Rademacher, sitting back here. and my sister, Marilee Booth Fisher, from Austin, Texas. I greeted Marilee about 30 minutes ago, and this is the first time I've seen her in 5 years. So this is a very special privilege for me to have you here, Marilee. These are her stories as much as they are mine, because the years of 1935 to 45 is the time that we lived in Grassy Township. And I'm sure you all know this, but this is a Williamson County road map, and this is Grassy Township right down here in the southwest corner of the county. And the folks back here, I can't remember your names, but
Gum.
they were residents of Grassy Township many years later. So I just really want to thank all of you for coming today. It's an honor for me to see so many of you here. I plan to talk some, and I'm also going to read to you some of the stories that I've written. And we'll have some time at the end for your comments if you wish. I did bring a bunch of pictures that are just representative of the time that I'm going to be talking about and some of the folks that you'll meet in my stories. I started writing these stories to let my children and my grandchildren and my great-grandchildren know some things about a way of life that doesn't exist anymore. I also wanted them to know how my childhood in Grassy Township shaped who I became as an adult person. I've written about the people, the customs, the culture of that rural township between those years of 1935 and 1945. And I chose to do that because I also wanted to write about how World War II changed the culture of that rural township, as did the acquisition of 74,000 acres of land in Williamson County at that same period of time. The stories I'm going to share with you reflect the memory and the interpretation of a child, and they may not always be factually accurate. Marilee may have a different story even than I do, but these are my memories of what that was like. In the very limited time that I have with you today, I've chosen to share. I've chosen to share stories that represent what I think is the Tennessee, Kentucky hill culture of that township during those years that I'm talking about. I'm going to talk about folk medicine. I'm going to talk about some of the people that I remember and why those folks were important in my life. The superstitions and the attitude towards strangers. And a little bit about the churches and the schools of that community. Churches and schools were very important, not only because they represented the religious and educational climate of the community, but because they also were the social hubs of everything that went on in the community. You either met folks at school or you met them at church, generally speaking. So they were very important in the community. And then I'm going to end with a little adventure at the Williamson County Fair, which you all probably have your own story of that. Let me just start by reading a few paragraphs from the introduction that I have to these stories. I start most of the stories with poems, or I include a poem somewhere in the story because to me that really enhances the writing that I do. Some of the poems are from favorite authors. Some of them are poems that I have written myself, and I'm not going to be sharing those with you today, but just so that you know, that's kind of a part of how I write. So in the introduction, I say, I'm sharing some stories from my childhood, a childhood that shaped who I have become as an adult. Grassy Township offered its people a simple, sincere, and authentic way of life, a way of life that no longer exists. These are stories of the predictable rhythms of rural life in the 1930s and early 40s. Farm work, the seasons, birth and death, spirituality, education, poverty, relationships, and community. Those rhythms were interrupted by World War II, and life in Grassy Township never quite regained that basic simplicity. I treasure a perpetual contact with the legacy of the elders, great-grandparents, grandchildren, mothers, fathers, aunts, uncles, little boys, and girls. Joan Borensinko says, quote, "If we are to find a path of our own, it helps to know and appreciate the path of others." The things that are most important to us as children hold many of the clues to those things that can still sustain our souls as adults. Electricity, septic tanks, gravel roads, and telephones had not yet come to Grassy Township in 1935, the year I was born. We did have rolling hills, pine forests, lakes, poor soil, coal stoves, kerosene lamps, and a little better than average one-room schools. Farming during the years 1935-45 was far more complex than planting, plowing, and harvesting. The farmers I knew were not making a profit from their venture. They were trying desperately to grow enough crops and food to ensure their family's survival from year to year. Farming was an every day of the year kind of job. Most farm families had barely accumulated enough money following the Depression to buy one or two fairly good used pieces of machinery when World War II came along and all new manufacturing was directed toward the war effort. The solution in some cases was to share machinery with family and neighbors and employ a cooperative arrangement for getting crops in the fields and harvested. It was a simple life. Many of the permanent families were from Scotch, Irish, and English ancestors who came to southern Illinois from the hills of Tennessee and Kentucky. The culture reflected an abundance of leftover attitudes from the Civil War, superstitions and folk tales, along with the very real history of coal mine riots, racial prejudice, bootlegging gangs of Charlie Berger and the Sheltons, the Ku Klux Klan, and the Heron Mine Massacre fed the constant fear in that rural community of strangers. My parents, as you heard earlier, Lee and Elva Booth, were longtime residents of Heron. They were both teachers. My dad was an administrator in the schools of Williamson County. The house where my grandparents lived on Little Grassy Lake Road was still standing until 2009. It was a shock when I drove past there and the house was gone. I was born in that house, and my parents, my sister, and my grandparents are key people in all these stories. So I want to start by telling you a story about my grandpa, Ephraim Monroe Davis. I would describe him as spiritual, not religious, but spiritual, intuitive, resourceful. He could put anything together with a piece of baling wire. He was a talented, self-taught musician, and he was emotionally a very fragile person. I call this story, Was He a Faith Healer? Grandpa Davis would have said, "I take fire out of burns." How did he do that? Well, I guess none of us really ever knew. The story of his gift had a very strange beginning. He told us the story many times, usually sitting on the front porch after supper in the summer. He began with, "When I was a young'un, just a lad about 5 or 6, I was playing in that great big old open hay window above the haystacks. The haystack had been put there by the farmers who were harvesting hay, and it was just below the hay track that ran up to the loft. We was a-playing in that window, and the boys started jumping out and jumping into the haystack. Well, I jumped out, and I landed right smack dab onto a pitchfork that somebody had left in the stack. Them prongs on that there fork went clear through my foot." At this point, he sometimes took off his shoe, especially if we encouraged him to do that, to show us exactly where the holes were still visible in the bottom of his foot and on the top of his foot about an inch from his middle toe. He continued, "My mother did everything she knowed to do. She put lard and turpentine on it, and she kept a clean rag wrapped around it, and it got infected. She put hot poultices and soaked it in salt water, but nothing seemed to do any good. Finally, she'd taken me to town to see old Doc Agnew." At this point, he had kind of a discouraged tone in his voice as he said that as he told us his mother's reaction to Doc Agnew's diagnosis of gangrene. Old Doc Agnew said he'd best take off my foot, and my mother said, "No, sir, yous ain't gonna cut off my boy's foot." And Doc said, if he didn't, I'd die. Grandpa then described how his mother took him home and made a decision to go to the hills of Tennessee to bring back an old woman who was known for her ability to heal. His mother brought the woman to live with them for the winter. Grandpa said, "She treated me every day and my foot commenced to get better. By spring, I could walk on it." Grandpa went on to tell us how the healer took a liking to him, and before she left to go back to Tennessee, she talked to him about her wish to pass on her gift to him. She told me she could only pass it along to one person in her lifetime. She ain't never found nobody who could take the gift, but she suspected I could. At this point, he just kind of always stopped the story. And maybe once in a while he would say, "And that's how I learned to take fire out of burns." Sometimes he just didn't say anything more. Could he really take fire out of burns? Well, all the people in the community thought he could. Once before I was born, a little girl in the community fell against a kettle of boiling lard at hog killing times. Her family just wrapped her up in a blanket and rushed her to my grandpa's house. He would say, "I never saw nothing so bad in my life." He told of sitting with her all night, taking out the fire. And then he would add, she never even had a scar. Once when I was about 4, I was having breakfast at my grandma and grandpa's house. Grandma started to pour boiling hot coffee in a cup, and for some reason, I just moved my hand into the stream of boiling hot coffee. I can still remember the pain, and Grandpa said, "Now, sister, you just be very still, and I'll take out that fire." I can still see the picture of the process in my mind. He took my hand in his, and he just sat for a few minutes, very still in a kind of state of meditation. And then he slowly put his mouth over the burned area. He never actually touched my skin with his mouth. He breathed in very slowly. maybe 10 seconds of slow breathing in, and then he held the breath for as long as he could. Finally, he blew out the breath very slowly and gently on the burned area. I would guess he kept up this procedure for about 20 minutes. He never said a word, and neither did I. And finally he stopped and said, "You'll be okay now, sister." I remember asking him how he knew when to stop. And he said, "When I can't feel the fire in my mouth no more." I don't remember any pain or blisters or redness after he stopped. Medicine was very simple in the late 1800s and early 1900s, and even the doctors, the country doctors like Dr. Griff, Miles, and Alonzo Baker, who all practiced in Grassy Township and the surrounding area, they all used herbs and plants and folk medicine as a part of their practice. Let me just run through a few things that I remember from my childhood that folk medicine and remedies that were being passed around. For ringworm, you apply the brown juice of a green walnut every 3 days until it stops. And I always wondered, my grandmother did that once when I had ringworm, and I always wondered, what happens if you get ringworm in the wintertime and there are no green walnuts? I don't know. For a sore throat, you mix 3 drops of kerosene plus a teaspoon of sugar. Now, my grandma always said you have to take a peach tree limb and you wrap a rag around it, a clean rag, and you dip it in turpentine, and then you swab your throat with it, and that gets rid of a sore throat. I probably did. For croup, you drink the juice of a roasted onion. If you have warts, during a full moon, you cut a raw potato in half, and you rub it on the warts, and then you bury the potato. And when the potato rots, the warts will be gone. If you have heartburn, you eat 2 peach kernels once a day for 4 days. It would be a long case of heartburn. For a wasp sting, you put chewed tobacco on the sting. And my grandpa used to do that all the time because he chewed tobacco. If you have high blood pressure, you can drink 2 tablespoons of apple cider vinegar with a glass of water every day. But my Uncle Mark Bloodworth also ate garlic for his blood pressure, and my dad used to say you can smell Mark coming for a quarter of a mile. My Aunt Joni always carried a buckeye in her apron pocket to ward off rheumatism. And we could go on and on, like if you eat fish and drink milk, you'll probably die. At least you'll have a big upset stomach. And if the shingles go all the way around your body, you're going to die. And if a fever does not break on the odd days of the week, 7 or 9 or 3 or 5, you'll die. If it breaks on the even days. My grandpa was also a diviner, a water witch. He used a forked willow stick and held it just so and walked around, and when the stick pointed down, that meant there was water underground. And people in Grassy Township reported that his divining was very reliable, and many water wells were dug in Grassy Township as a result of his predictions. He was a beekeeper and a self-taught musician, as I said. He and his 4 brothers all played string instruments, and they played for dances. That is, until he met my grandmother, Nora. And my grandmother thought that dancing and playing cards was definitely the devil's work, and so he stopped playing. I have a story in the collection about his making cane flutes for me and my sister. That's a great story. Wish I had time to tell you about the interesting people, all the interesting people that I remember in Grassy Township in those years, but let me just mention a few names and then tell you about 2 or 3 people. the closest neighbors and friends were the Burklows and Femisters, Parishes, Watsons, Donald, Jean, and Helen Watson. They still farm and live in Grassy Township. The Dimmings, Crowells, Kellys, Kings, Futrals, Johnsons, and Gowers. And other people were the Pecks and the Ogdens and Cranes, Wilsons, Lockharts, Antnips, Coxes, Batsons, Hales, and Hendersons. Some of those names may ring a bell with some of you. The Dimmings were an interesting family. They had several children, but I believe their youngest son was Harry Dimming. And Harry was speech and hearing impaired. And in those days, in that community, we called him deaf and dumb. Mother and Grandpa Davis knew sign language, which always fascinated me. And they could speak with Harry when he came to our house. And he always loved to come and talk with my mother. He would ride a white horse and just stop every occasion that he had because she could speak with him. And I don't think there were very many people in the community who knew sign language. I was 4 or 5 years old when Mrs. Dimming died. And we were going to pay our respects. And my mother put my clothes out on the bed and she said, "Now Betty, you get dressed while I get merrily dressed." Well, okay, fine. So I did, and we got in the car and we went to the Dimmings' house, and we were almost there, and I started crying and crying, and she said, "Now what's the matter with you?" And I said, "I don't have on any panties. I forgot to put on my panties." And she said, "Well, that's just too bad. You're going anyhow, and you're going to find a chair right by the door, and you're going to sit down, and you're going to pull your dress tail over your knees, and you're going to stay there until it's time to go home." And I did. But I still remember it. A couple of days later, they were going to take Mrs. Dimming's casket to the funeral and burial, and my dad was a pallbearer, and they couldn't get the casket out the door. When the undertakers had brought the casket, they had tipped it and took it into the house, but with Mrs. Dimming in it and the pallbearers, they couldn't get it out the door, and they kept trying and trying and trying, and it just wouldn't work. So somebody suggested, let's just take out the windows in the living room, and we'll put the casket through. There were double windows, and we'll put the casket through the windows, and that's what they did. And they put the casket in a wagon and took it to the burial. Ogle and Mildred Burklow were my mother and dad's very best friends. Mildred Burklow was like my ideal woman. She was the only person I ever knew who bought toilet paper. I loved to go to her house. And of course, the rest of us used Sears and Roebuck catalogs. Mildred also was the first woman I knew who made Jell-O. And we had no refrigeration, no electricity, of course, and so making Jell-O was a real challenge. And she went to town and bought 75 pounds of ice, made Jell-O and brought it to a church dinner, and she was the talk of the community for a long time after that. There were lots of rituals and customs that are related to birth and death. My Aunt Carrie and Uncle Mark Bloodworth, my grandmother's brother, lived the house to the east of us, and I want to tell you about Aunt Carrie's dying. Aunt Carrie was a big, jolly, soft kind of woman who was an excellent cook. I can only picture her in the kitchen, either her kitchen or our kitchen at haymaking or hog killing time. When I was about 4, Aunt Carrie became very ill, and I remember the night she died. The family all gathered round to help as much as possible. She was lying in the bed in the front bedroom of their house, and it became very late, and several people decided to stay the night because they knew she was going to die. Mother and Ruby Themister made a bed on a day bed in the living room for me, Marilee, Arlita, and Lee. Marilee and I were at one end, and Arlita and Lee were at the other end. And Aunt Carrie did die during the early morning hours. My grandmother washed her body, dressed her in a clean gown, put $50 on her eyelids, tied a large handkerchief under her chin to keep her mouth closed. Grandma folded Carrie's hands across her body, and these restraints were kept on her body until rigor mortis started to set in. Grandmother did this as she waited for the funeral home personnel to bring a casket and prepare Aunt Carrie for lying in state. As we waited, Grandma Davis invited any of the children who wished to come into the room to come see Carrie. She explained everything to us, and she answered all our questions. It was one of the most loving, quiet, peaceful, ordinary experiences I've ever had. Death was not scary. It was just the end of living. The undertaker brought a casket about noon, and the body was placed in it. Aunt Carrie lay in state in the corner of her living room for a couple of days while family and friends came to pay their respects. Bodies were usually not embalmed in Grassy Township. Maybe that was about money, maybe it was about transportation. We had dirt roads and it was hard to get a body in and out. But I think it was more just custom and tradition in that rural community. When a casket was in a family home during the summer, they always put a fine net over the casket to keep the flies and the bugs away from the body until the time of burial. The Crowells, Charlie, Maggie, Clifton, Neva, and their children, Junior, Calvin, Joyce, and some other little ones that I don't remember, lived east of our house as well. And one hot summer afternoon, about 3 o'clock, a hay wagon piled high with hay, with a woman sitting on top of the hay, stopped in front of our house. And Clifton Crowell came up to our door and he said, "Elva, is Aunt Nori here?" And Mother said, "Well, yes, she is, Clifton." And so my grandmother came to the door. My grandmother often came to our house during haymaking time and helped with food and stuff. And Clifton said, "Aunt Nori, Neva's going to have a young'un, and she wants you to come and help her." And so my grandmother said, "Sure, I'll come." And so Clifton went back to the hay wagon and drove away, and my grandmother put on a clean apron, and my mother drove her in the car to the Crowell's house. Sometime around dark that evening, my grandma came home, and she said, "You know, Neva had been stacking on hay all day long, and she climbed down off that hay wagon, and within an hour had a baby, and it's healthy and fine, and so is she." So birth and death were just kind of ordinary things that happened. Now, we never knew how babies got to be growing before they were born, because sex was something my mother never, ever allowed us to talk about or to know about. I have some stories about that too. I'm not going to read those. The Watsons were our closest neighbor. And Fred, Reba, Fred's mother, Oli, and their children, Jean, Donald, and Helen, lived just like less than a quarter of a mile from us. The Watson kids were exceptional students. My dad loved having them in his classroom. They were very, very bright. They were diligent at completing all their homework. They made the best grades of anybody in the school. And Donald and Jean have both been very successful farmers, still farm several acres, many acres of land in Grassy Township. And Reba was still living on the farm place until just a very few years ago. My mother was reluctant to have us go play with the Watson children, and we usually had to play in the road rather than at either house. And you know why? Because the Watsons didn't go to church. If you knew my mother, you can believe that. I have stories about churches and schools. That may be for another day. But two of the important people in the church were Claude Childers and Miss Opal McLaren. And let me read a little bit to you. The revival meeting preachers were scary. Well, most of them were. The only ones I remember who were not scary were the wonderful, loving people like Claude Childers and Miss Opal McLaren, and there are pictures of them on the table. Claude first came to South County Line Christian Church to hold a revival, and after the revival he stayed as a pastor. He was well received because he was a good preacher and because the community held his father in such high regard. The Reverend Jesse Childers had preached at Cottage Grove Freewill Baptist Church for several years and was a well-known and well-liked revival preacher. At the time I was growing up, I didn't know how unusual and controversial it was for a woman to preach. I had never seen a woman preacher before Miss Opal McLaren, but it never seemed strange to me once I knew Opal. Bessie Childers told me that Opal was not allowed to preach in any of the churches in her home community. When Claude heard about how she was being treated, he just said, "You come along and do some revivals with me, and I'll find a church that will call you." Since Claude and the Reverend Jesse were so well respected, folks were willing to accept anyone who would vouch for them. We had preaching only one Sunday a month in the winter and every other Sunday in the summer. And once in a while, on the off Sunday, a visiting preacher would be in the community and would fill the pulpit. We always hoped that it wasn't somebody like Charlie Taylor, who thought anything short of a 2-hour sermon wasn't worth covering. I remember when my folks heard that Charlie Taylor was going to preach a funeral, they'd talk about whether they wanted to go or not. There are many wonderful comments in my stories about Claude and Miss Opal. Superstitions and fears of strangers was something that many country women and mothers tried to pass on to their children. There were lots of stories going around all the time about why you should not speak to strangers or why you should not entertain strangers. But Halloween was a favorite time to just create more anxiety about strangers and to keep that fear well and alive. I want to read a Halloween story. When the days began to get shorter in late September, darkness started to creep in while we sat on the front porch after supper. This set the stage for someone to tell a story about the rowdy young boys who turned over the old man's outhouse while he was sitting on the hole reading the Sears Roebuck Cat. That called for another favorite Halloween prank story about the boys who built a straw ghost, covered it with a white sheet, attached it with ropes to a tree limb, and dropped it right in front of the horse and buggy as a love-struck young couple drove home from church on a lonely country road. As it got a little darker, a comment was made about hearing the rooster crow at midnight on the night Aunt Mahalie Cox died. And of course there was the time the 3 knocks on the headboard of the bed warned that there was another death in the family. On a sober and serious note, they told of waking at night to the pounding of many horses' hoofs galloping full out on a country road. This was followed by an account of the father who put his children and wife under the bed and stood by the door with a shotgun to see if the 20 or so KKK members in white hoods and robes would stop for him or ride on by his house. I think the grown-ups were as afraid as the kids after one of these storytelling sessions. And well, they might have been, for customs and prejudices and grudges lived a long, long life in Grassy Township. And now a story about a Halloween experience that Marilee and I had. When we got home from school on Halloween afternoon, Mother had 3 or 4 nice little pumpkins, a couple of knives, 2 big spoons for scooping out seeds, and a bucket for waste. These were all ready and setting up. She said, "I thought it would be fun for you to make some jack-o'-lanterns for Halloween. Would you like that?" "Oh yeah," we shouted and ran off quickly to find some warm clothes to put on. Mother suggested that we might like to go out beside the garage just at the top of the driveway hill. She said, "You'll be out of the wind and there's plenty of room to carve," so off we went. We were having a wonderful time cutting the pumpkin faces and deciding how to make each look different. We had probably been out by the garage for about 30 or 40 minutes and the sun was just beginning to go down. It was a good thing because we were almost finished and it was getting cold. We looked up and saw a strange-looking man walking on the road just east of our mailbox. "Do you know who that is?" I asked Marilee. She took a good look and said, "No, he looks kind of strange." We noticed that he was dressed in overalls and a barn coat that looked too big for him. He had on an old dark felt hat pulled down around his ears and covering the top half of his face. He leaned on a long walking stick and was dragging a gunny sack on the ground behind him. "What should we do?" Marilee asked. "I don't know, but maybe we could just be real quiet and he won't see us," I offered. So we just tried to be as quiet as possible and stay as close to the ground as we could. The strange-looking man stopped at our mailbox. He examined it for a minute, stood in the driveway looking up the hill at the house, and then turned into the drive and started up the hill. "It's a gypsy! Run, run, run as fast as you can," I yelled. We took off for the back porch that was about 75 yards away. And of course, Mother had been hinting that there were gypsies in the community and that if they found little kids, they would take them and they'd never be seen again. We bolted through the screen door, scrambled to turn the knob on the kitchen door, and immediately started screaming, "Mother, Mother, there's a gypsy coming." We raced through the kitchen into the dining room, still screaming. We turned right into the front room and through the bedroom. And at about that time, we realized that Mother was not in the house. And we heard this man banging his walking stick on the back screen door. Marilee started crying and saying, "What will we do? What will we do?" I had tears in my eyes too, but because I was the big sister and older, I had to think of something. "Let's hide in the clothes closet," I whispered. All the time I had the fingers crossed on both my hands because I thought that might keep bad things from happening. "I can't go in the clothes closet if you close the door. I'm scared of the closet," she whimpered. At just about that moment, we heard the screen door open and heavy footsteps coming across the porch. I just pushed her as fast as I could into the closet and behind the hanging clothes. Then I closed the door tight and crawled back until I could feel her under the clothes. It was as dark as night in that closet. We were both sobbing by that time, but trying not to make a sound. She whispered, "I want out of here. I'm going to open the door." And I just pushed her back and said, "You go out and he'll drag you off in that sack." We could hear the bump, bump, bump of his walking stick as he crossed the kitchen floor, and then it sounded as if he knocked over one of the kitchen chairs or something. He was kind of making grumbling sounds, but not saying any words. For a few minutes we couldn't tell where he was, and sometimes it would be totally quiet for maybe a minute or two. And then I grabbed Marilee and put my hands over her mouth because I could hear him coming into the bedroom. He was hitting the furniture with his stick. We didn't even breathe. He was close, just outside the closet door. The door opened. Just a little sliver of light came through the opening, and he stuck the stick in the closet and jabbed it around a little, and then walked away, leaving the door ajar. We still didn't breathe. After what seemed like an eternity, we heard the kitchen door open, the footsteps crossed the porch, and the screen door slammed loudly. I took my hands away, and she whispered, "I think he's gone." I just started crying. I could barely hear her say, "I have to get out of here." I managed to say, "No, you can't go yet." But my pleas went unheard. She stayed in that closet as long as she could. She was more afraid in there than of what he might do if he caught her. I stayed for a while longer, got out slowly and looked around, and he was gone. We were huddled on the kitchen floor by the door crying when Mother came into the house announcing that she'd just been out to the barn for a while. With both of us crying hysterically and talking at the same time, she listened to our story about how the gypsy almost carried us away in the gunny sack. And then she just started laughing and laughing and laughing and told us it was a Halloween prank. And finally she said, "It was just me. It was just me, dressed up as." Well, it wasn't funny. Marilee was so angry, and she couldn't stop crying even after we knew it was Mother. And you know what? It still is not funny. I'm going to read one more story to you, and the version of this next story could be a part of your own childhood if you've lived most of your life in Williamson County. And I call this simply the Williamson County Fair. The most exciting amusement of my entire childhood was the annual Williamson County Fair. I can still feel my heartbeat faster and the excitement mount just thinking about how very much I looked forward to that week in September. Schools in Williamson County were even dismissed one day during the fair. And who could resist the prospect of fresh taffy or cotton candy? The taffy wagon was usually right in front of the entrance to the grandstand. It was a glass-covered wagon with bright lights and a little door where the money and candy were exchanged. Beautiful young women in red and white striped uniforms and perky little hats that looked a lot like nurses' caps kept the strands of taffy pulling round and round on metal rods, and when the candy was perfectly pulled, they removed the strands, put it on a board covered with fine powdered sugar, and cut it into bite-sized pieces and quickly wrapped it in red and white wax paper. Watching the whole process was a lot more fun than actually eating the candy. And the same was true for the bright pink cotton candy that was constantly spinning around, just waiting to be attached to a paper tube and handed to an eager child. My family always went to the fair twice, once the day school was dismissed and one additional night. And we would often choose a Friday or Saturday night to go because it was late and then we didn't have to go to school the next day. And they would often take a picnic lunch on the full day that we went and meet other family members from Marion there for a noon meal. And Mother and Daddy always said you can have a bought sandwich, which was the only time the whole year that we ever had a bought sandwich. And they always had hamburgers because we did not eat beef at home. We often had a roasted frankfurter with relish and mustard. But the best thing was the snow cones. And if we were really good, we could have a snow cone. And the shaved ice in the paper cup with the bright colored flavor was so good. Just having ice to eat in the summertime was a great great treat for country kids who didn't have any refrigeration. That was the only time we ever had shaved ice, of course. And the best electronic ride on the Midway for little kids was those cars that went round and round the track. And second best was the merry-go-round with the beautiful painted horses that went up and down and the wonderful calliope sounds. And when we were little, we had to ride horses that were side by side so Mother could stand in between us. And it was a wonderful day when we got to ride without her on the merry-go-round. At night, it was so exciting just to stand and watch the bright colored lights on the Ferris wheel and the tilt-a-whirls. When we passed the swings, Mother told the same story year after year after year. She said, "You must never ride those swings." A few years ago, a young girl was on the swings high up in the air when the chain on her chair broke, and every year she was higher. She went flying through the air and slammed down on the ground quite a ways from the ride, and she was dead when the folks got to her. And her story was so vivid and so clear that we would have never, ever thought of going on the swing. I doubt that I would today. We were never allowed to spend any money at the stands filled with fabulous prizes, stuffed animals, monkeys that ran up and down the stick, whips, Kewpie dolls, pinwheels, balloons, and too many other prizes to mention. The Barkers made it sound so easy to win, but Mother and Daddy always warned they just cheat you out of your money. We could always stand, however, and watch other people get cheated out of their money. And sometimes they won a prize. I always encouraged Daddy to throw baseballs at clowns or at wooden milk bottles, and I thought he should try his luck at hitting a metal platform with a big mallet to make a bell ring, but he said, "No, honey, they have that rigged too." On the way to the women's display and the cattle barns, we had to pass all the tents with the girly shows and the world's greatest wonders. Mother always said, "Now you girls, don't look at those dancing girls." Of course, we had to peek a little bit. And we were allowed to look at the banners announcing a two-headed calf, a snake handler, a 300-pound bearded lady, a wild man with native tattoos covering his whole naked body, Siamese twins, the creature that was half man and half woman. We never went in these tents, of course, to see any of these attractions, but between those, a few of the wonders sometimes would be brought out onto the stage. I think people didn't think much about that, but today I think, what exploitation. I can't imagine that kind of thing happening today. I thought it was nice to go for an afternoon with Mother and Grandma Davis to the women's building. We looked long and admiringly at the beautiful quilts, fancy crochet and knitting, embroidery and needlework of all kinds. There were wonderful displays of canned fruit, jellies, jams, and rows of prize garden produce. None of this was any better than the rows and rows of canned fruit and vegetables in our own cellars. But what a special affirmation of the value of all the ordinary things that farm women did in those days, all the time. The red and blue ribbons confirmed that the products of this hard labor were good. We realized that work done by farm women was highly valued. Mother and Daddy enjoyed going into the big grandstand to watch the horse races and the cattle shows. We always sat high up in the free seats. We often found people we knew to sit near and visit, and the very important people, whoever they were, sat in the box seats close to the racetrack. Everybody went to the Williamson County Fair and went home hardly able to wait till next year to go again. And I'm just going to read to you from my table of contents the titles of some of my other stories. But that's the last one I'm going to read. The introduction you heard, Spiller Ridge is the name of the farm where my family lived. Gardening, cane flutes, hog killings, country churches, one-room schools, a child's view of farming. We do the wash on Monday. Christmas came early. Our first beauty shop permanence. The cellar. The farm woman's #1 enemy. She fell in the quicksand. Nighttime in Carbondale. Carbondale during the day. Just cut off my feet. Smoking. All day in an apple tree. A rail fence playhouse, fence rail playhouse. Creative rocking. What's happening in the outside world? World War II. And the final section of these stories is called Moving Forward While Looking Back. And under that, the topics Grassy Township changes, people who shaped my life, the journey to here, confidence gained and lost too many times to count, marriage and parenting, a new path on the journey, going a different direction, moving on or stepping back, the retirement years. Getting old really is fun. Thank you.
Betty would welcome any questions or discussions. You can certainly take a look at all these wonderful pictures that she has, and we have some light refreshments for you as well. So we'll do that while you can ask her.
Thank you so much.
Tell us your father's name again.
Lee Booth. I do have a copy of that book that he and I wrote together on Williamson County Schools. The Williamson County Historical Society actually published this. And it was during the sesquicentennial year, and we gave all the profits to the Historical Society. It was a fun project.
I'd like to say something. This is a fabulous lady. She's amazing. But the story that I have to go with this book is that 3 or 4 years ago, when she had this project going, she could only write down here in Southern Illinois. She couldn't write up in Bloomington because that's where her head had to be. And so she came down here by herself because I couldn't be a part of that either because I disrupted that thinking process. So she was down here for about a week, and she came back home, and she was so excited about everything. And I said, "Oh, you've really made some headway on this book." She says, "Oh, yeah." She says, "You know," she says, "for the first 3 days, I just sat in my rocker on my porch, and I tried to think of all of the people that lived in Little Grassy Township." Keep in mind, she was only 0 to 10 years old. And she said, "I think I came up with every single family that lived in that township during the years 35 to 45. And so her memory is just unbelievable. And so all of these stories that she talks about are all from memory. It's just fabulous.
He's just a little prejudiced.
I was gonna ask him later, just in private. That life with her is interesting.
Well, it's not boring.
Is there any cemeteries out there now?
Well,
Relatives in?
the cemetery where all of my Davis and Bloodworth relatives are buried is Gentry, which is on that Rocky Comfort Road. The Eskews sort of tend to that cemetery, but it's a lovely, lovely old cemetery. And I think the road is called Gentry that goes up to the cemetery. There's an Oak Cemetery that's across from where Oak School was. And Oak School, the building is still there. It's now a dwelling residence. And that's on Little Grassy Lake Road. There's an old cemetery on my land, but my house is in Southern Township, not Grassy.
Down from where we used to live there is an old grown-up area. It's just north of what's now the Girl Scout camp. And there's some 1850, 60 tombstones in the woods.
Just in the.
And of course, South County Line Christian Church, which is right there on the Jackson-Williamson County line, just right there. It's still a functioning church and has a huge cemetery, and a great-great-grandparent is buried in County Line. County Line is a big cemetery, and in the book, when you meet people like the Johnsons and the Gowers and the Futrells and the Rendlemans, they're all buried over there at South County Line. That's a big cemetery.
Does anyone know about the cemetery that's behind what used to be the Oddfellows camp at Lake of Egypt?
There's the Oddfellows Cemetery.
Well, I don't know if it's
Lake
the
of
Oddfellows, that's where the camp was at.
I know the Odd, are you saying Lake of Egypt or South?
No, I didn't do
Between
Lake of
Grassy and
Egypt, I'm
Grassy.
sorry, Little Grassy Lake.
Well, between, yeah, it's on south, it's on the east side of the road, right? The cemetery's on the east side, and the Oddfellows camp was actually on the west side.
Well,
I can't remember. It's
Wolf Creek Cemetery may be in Grassy Township or Southern, I'm not sure. Wolf Creek is right on the line.
My grandparents.
Your grandparents are buried at
One of
Wolf
my
Creek.
grandmothers, some of my father's friends.
The Carterville Township and Grassy Township, approximately, where is that?
They touch.
They touch? Oh, they touch, but is that after Crab Orchard Lake or before?
Yeah, Crab Orchard Lake is right here. And of course, this map was done before Devil's Kitchen and Little Grassy. So, but Crab Orchard is here. And this is Carterville Township right here. And then West Marion is here, Southern, East Marion, Blairsville.
My dad had a relative that lived where they built, I don't know, Emily might know who it is, where they
Betty,
built,
what-
well, they built Devil's Kitchen, like,
Devil's Kitchen.
farm down there.
Well, my
Before
grandmother.
they built it.
Yeah.
I remember going down there.
My grandmother's maiden name was Bloodworth, and she always said that her folks were from Rocky Comfort and Panther Den Holler.
Yeah.
Betty, what year, and I know someone in this room knows it, but I think you would know too, what year did they begin to dig Crab Orchard?
Well, Crab Orchard was in the 30s. And Crab Orchard was kind of a lake to begin with because Crab Orchard Creek ran into it, but I remember in 39 and 40 when they started building the ammunition plants and the federal government started taking the land, I remember armed military guards walked the dam at Crab Orchard because there was fear that enemy sources would destroy that dam and flood that whole ammunition building process.
In the Ordeal area.
In the Ordeal, yeah. And the federal government bought 74,000 acres of land in Williamson County. Many of the farms in Grassy were bought by the federal government. I was in first grade the last year that Mann School operated. And when we started school in September, there were 20 kids, I believe, in Mann School. We ended the year with 6. And the reason those other children were no longer in school was that their land had been bought by the federal government. I also remember the planting of many of the white pine forests. We went to school at New Hope after Mann closed, and we walked through the pine forests that are in that part of the township, and they were only like maybe 8 or 10 feet tall at that time.
My grandfather, John Heron, owned a farm that the government took over. It was good land
Yeah,
for the crab orchard. A lot of good land was taken for that lake.
well, there were many schools and cemeteries in West Marion Township that were closed because of the closed area for the ordinance plan.
Your father was distantly related on my mother's side. And I've heard my mother say that he was, his parents died young, or his mother.
Well, my dad, I would call him an orphan child.
That's right.
His mother died when he was 6 years old. He had a brother, Earl, who was 7 years older than he, and Johnny Booth lived here in Heron, Dorothy, for all their married life, actually. And she died when Johnny was just 6 weeks old, I believe. But my grandfather, this is really complicated, you probably don't want to hear this. My grandfather, Booth, had been married before, and his wife, Aubrey, and he had 2 daughters, Hazel Booth Growl, and Ray Booth Wilson. And they were in their teens when their mother died. And then he married his dead wife's sister, who was my dad's
That
mother.
was common back then.
And then when she died, my grandfather's brother and his wife took this baby, but the other 2 children just kind of got farmed out, my Uncle Earl and my dad. And they were kind of put around with different relatives who were willing to take them. And one of my dad's favorite stories as an educator is that when he was in second grade, I guess, they moved to West Frankfort and nobody enrolled them in school, and they just wandered around the streets like little homeless kids until Christmas, and they didn't go to school. And so then his sister, his half-sister, took him and basically put him in school out at Bainbridge, and that's where he did his elementary school.
They talk about high-risk children today.
Oh, my
And
gosh.
who could grow up to be a finer man than their father was.
Well, he was a very self-directed person, very, very self-directed.
My grandmother's sister was married to a Booth, and I
Now, who was
can't
your
think of his
grandmother's
first name.
Who was your grandmother's sister?
Caroline was her name. Caroline.
She was married
White,
to,
Caroline White.
she was married to my grandfather Booth's brother.
Okay. That's how my mother knew about your dad.
Yeah.
We wish you had your book with you published, we'd all buy it, so I hope you will get that done for us. We
Well,
would love it.
maybe I will. Maybe I will. It's very nice of you to say that, because I wrote this just for my family. You know, I didn't write it because I didn't know if other people would be interested.
And besides, it makes us think of our childhood, and that would be very nice reading to children. They would love hearing those stories. I mean, they're true.
Yes, they're true as I remember them. My daughter Karen said, Aunt Mary's going to be saying, wait a minute, that's not what I remember.
Some of the names you mentioned, like Cudrell, I
Cudrells.
remember there was a Charlie Futrell that lived in Energy. He worked at the post office. My father was postmaster. And there was a tragic accident. He had a gun shop, and they carried the guns in every night. And his wife, I guess, one of the guns was loaded, and she was killed. And they had a nice life, nice children. And he later married Carl Goodwin's aunt, Isaiah, who I
Well,
think was his
The
favorite aunt.
The Futrells who lived in our community lived just an eighth of a mile north and a little bit east of South County Line Church, and their names were Floyd and Bessie Futrell, and they had 5 or 6 kids. I'll have to tell you just one more story, and then we're gonna. When my dad was very close to death, he was out at Park Avenue nursing home. And I went to visit him every day when I was down here, and I discovered that Mrs. Futrell was there as well. And so I got reacquainted with all the Futrell kids, but one day I was sitting by Mrs. Futrell and I said, "Mrs. Futrell, do you remember Lee Booth?" "Oh yes," she said. "I remember him. He was the teacher at our school. My kids went to school with him." I said, "Well, that's Mr. Booth." She says, "Oh no, he was young and had dark hair." Okay, have some refreshment.
Our boys grew up there, but we didn't. End of 92.
Actually, I got a phone call from the service staff, and they called me up into the hospital or something, but I'll get
She was a king. We lived on what we call King Road. So I was king. His wife had